Jiena Gabriellija u nilqakom għal edizzjoni oħra tal-programm What's on Newsbook. L-attivista u riċerkatriċi Dr. Marija Pisani qalet li hemm immigranti tfal li ħarbu mill-Libja biex ifittxu ħajja aħjar fl-Ewropa imma jispiċċaw fiċ-ċentri ta' detenzjoni f'Malta. Il-ġurnalista ta' newsbook.com.mt Monika Ġus intervistat lil Dr. Pisani li tkellmet dwar is-sitwazzjoni ta' dawn il-minorenni brabta mal-pubblikazzjoni ta' riċerka ta' JRS Malta dwar l-esperjenzi ta' tfal li jkunu ifittxu l-ażil. Nisimgħu din l-intervista fl-imkien.
Dr. Maria Pisani, thank you for accepting our invitation for this interview about a study which JRS, the Jesuit Refugee Services, did, and which, in our opinion, was much needed about unaccompanied minors. Before we start with focusing on the study, who are the unaccompanied minors? Who are we talking about?
So when we're talking about unaccompanied minors, we're focusing, for the purpose of this research, we were focusing specifically on those young people, children under the age of 18, so by law minors, who travelled to Malta across the Mediterranean Sea by boat and arrived here on their own. In other words, there was no adult or family member responsible for their care. And that was the exclusive focus of this research. Broader, in more broader terms, an unaccompanied minor would be somebody who is arriving in Malta, who is a child under the age of 18 and, again, is not accompanied by a family member or an adult responsible for their care.
We're talking about people travelling to Malta, and also in this context we're talking about people who take perilous voyage from Libya to Malta. How from the research and also from your work in the field, how frequent is it that we have such children, unaccompanied minors, arriving on our shores?
As you're aware, these movements across the Mediterranean Sea have been going on for 2 decades. And for more than 20 years now, we have always had unaccompanied minors travelling across the Mediterranean and reaching our shores. So certainly this is not a new phenomena. But over the last few years, we've seen a significant increase in the number of people making the journey and their ages. And whilst there are some that are very young, we're essentially looking at children and young people from 14 years of age, 15, 16-year-olds in significant numbers.
Once these children are here, 14 to 16 are here, and they are accompanied, unaccompanied, what happens to them? So theoretically, let's speak about the theoretical aspect and then focus a bit more on the practical aspect, because we know that what's in theory not necessarily is applied. So what are the procedures they should go through, and what's different to when having an adult, when dealing with someone who's over 18?
Apart from international human rights law that you would be familiar with vis-a-vis the arrival of asylum seekers, obviously these children are protected by the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In simple terms, the best way of perhaps understanding it is that what we are talking about and who we are talking about is children first and foremost. Everything else around it is secondary. So without even speaking about international law, what are we prepared to do in order to be able to protect and look after the best interests of these children and young people? Now, as per international law, our legal and moral responsibility is to prioritise their care and their protection. In other words, to ensure that they are protected from harm. In 2013, the Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat at that time, acknowledged more than a decade of reports by that point that documented the abuse and violation of children's rights arriving in Malta. In other words, the ongoing detention of unaccompanied minors in Malta and the conditions that they were being detained in. So back in 2013, the government of Malta at that time made a strong commitment not to detain children anymore in Malta. At the time, boats weren't coming to Malta. The numbers had slowed right down. The numbers started increasing, or started again a couple of years later, and to date, we still detain all unaccompanied minors that arrive in Malta by boat. and we detain them under the most horrific conditions. And this is one of the reasons why we conducted this research. It's not the only reason, but it was a motivation, if you like, to give voice to unaccompanied minors arriving in Malta. And I think perhaps importantly, there's a couple of things that I want to highlight here. The first is we're not simply talking about failure to protect or neglect. What we are saying is what is clear from the narratives of these unaccompanied minors that we interviewed for the purpose of this research is that the government of Malta, the state, we as Maltese, have been the source of violence and terror on young people arriving in Malta. It's not just that their rights are being violated, clearly violated under international human rights law. We are violating them. We are violating their bodies, and we are violating who they are. We are violating children.
I think you've brought also very early in the interview this violation of their rights and the violations of the body. So for someone who's not acquainted with the situation, because it's just another number and we're not usually given details about how many unaccompanied minors there are on a boat, unless it's an NGO which highlights this. In what ways? So the children are taken to Hal Far, the children are taken to Hal Safi, or are they treated, or should they be treated differently? So when you are a child at law, you would need a legal representative. So in terms of legal procedures and also in terms of practicality, because we're talking about children who would not necessarily be aware of their rights at law.
Obviously, the vast majority, if not all, unaccompanied minors are not familiar with their rights as per law. But they know when they're being neglected and abused, that much they're very clear about. So when they arrive in Malta, despite the provisions that are there in law and recent changes to law as well, what we found through the narratives, the interviews that we conducted, in the case of all of the unaccompanied minors that arrived in Malta, they were immediately placed in detention. They were placed in detention with adults that they did not know and do not know. These are in conditions that were often very violent. They did not have, even those that were, two of them, I believe, were eventually appointed a guardian, a legal guardian, but were not familiar with who their guardian was. So even in the case where the procedure went through and they were granted this form of protection, in reality, it didn't translate into very much for them. And when I say detained, I'm talking about months on end. One of the boys that we spoke to arrived when he was 16 years of age and was detained in Safi for 9 months. Monique, I want to stop you there. Think about 9 months. Think about what you were doing 9 months ago. Because we talk about these numbers, we throw these numbers off as if they mean nothing. I mean, we're in June. We're at the beginning of May. So we're talking about September. Imagine what you were doing back in September. That is the time frame that we're talking about, being locked away with strangers, with no information, no access to care, no access to education, no games, no sports, no friends, detained under the most horrific conditions, children.
Għadna kemm smajna l-intervista lill-ġurnalista ta' newsbook.com.mt Monika Ġus għamlet mal-attivista u riċerkatriċi Dr. Marija Pisani li tkellmet dwar l-immigranti tfal li kont jaħarbu mill-Libja biex ifittxu ħajja aħjar fl-Ewropa imma jispiċċew fiċ-ċentri detenzjoni f'Malta. Jiena Gabriel Lija nirringrazzjakom li segwejtu edizzjoni oħra tal-programm What's on Newsbook u fil-waqt li nawguralkom il-wafsnar tajjeb insellmilkom.